So I was having a conversation with a random group of people the other day while playing a video game, and religion was brought up, which to me was absolutely wonderful, as I love talking about it. But one of the people in the call said something that really isn't surprising, but it is the real reason why she couldn't accept the God of the Bible. She brought up the idea that the God of the Old Testament was different than the God of the New Testament. And one of the main examples she gave was when God commanded genocide. This idea that the God of the Old Testament is just angry and kills people, and the God of the New Testament, Jesus, is all about love and happiness. And she brought up genocide because there's a passage in the book of Joshua where God tells his people to go into a city and kill everything. Men, women, children, and livestock. Leave nothing alive. And not even just once. This command comes out more than once through Joshua, through Deuteronomy, and through Numbers. Kill them, wipe them out, devote them to destruction. And if you're reading that for the first time, or if you've read it 100 times, it might still make you uncomfortable. Good. That discomfort is the right starting place. Anyone who picks up a Bible, reads those passages, and then feels nothing really hasn't been paying attention to what's been going on there. Because it's a very real thing. And this is the exact kind of text that skeptics will pick up and wave around as evidence that the God of the Bible is not good. That he's not just morally complicated in the way all interesting characters are, but that he was actually a monster. To quote Richard Dawkins in The God Delusion, he described the God of the Old Testament as arguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capriciously malevolent bully. Wow, that's a lot of adjectives. But underneath all of them is a real concern. He is pointing to real passages. He's not making them up. And that's what I want to talk about today. Because here's what I found after spending, who knows, a lot of time with these texts. The people who are the loudest on both sides of this debate are seemingly working with an incomplete picture of what's going on. The critics of the Bible read the surface of the text and stop there. Oh, God clearly said kill all of them, and he means exactly what he says. And then the other, even Christians defending this, often reach for reassurances that sometimes don't hold up, although they mean well. And what you get if you actually dig into the archaeology, the Hebrew, into the ancient Near Eastern background of this story and what's going on, and into the theology that it's trying to teach, it is something so much stranger and, I'd argue, much more coherent than either side usually presents. And once you understand this, you will never read the Old Testament the same way again. And more importantly, we'll get an explanation of why exactly God was telling the Israelites to do that in the first place. Because the reason is a lot stranger than what most people realize. We're going to be covering a lot of ground today. We're going to ask whether any of this stuff actually happened historically, because believe it or not, that question matters than what most people realize. We're going to be looking at what the conquest commands actually say in their original language, which turns out to be quite different from how they're usually described. And then we're also going to be getting into a part of the Old Testament's worldview that most people have never really encountered, unless you're, a regular viewer of this channel, which is, stuff that I talk about a lot, which involves divine beings and a massive conflict going back all the way to before the flood. And we're also going to be talking about an ancient Canaanite text called the Curta Epic that has some genuinely strange parallels to the book of Joshua and what those parallels tell us. And then we're also going to end up at a confrontation in a valley that most people know as a children's story about bravery, but which is actually the conclusion of a giant theological war that started centuries before Joshua was born. Remember, we are reading this text, this Bible of ours, thousands of years later than what it was written. And something that we love to do on this channel is to get the ancient Hebrew person living in your head and thinking about what they would be thinking about when they heard and read these stories. It's really the only way to do it, because any context outside of that really doesn't do us any justice with trying to understand what they would have been thinking about. So there have been many people, scholars, theologians, whatever, who have done so much work to allow us today, and through archaeology and stuff, to allow us to have a better understanding of what was actually going on in the ancient world. The only problem is it takes a lot of work to go through, but that's why I'm here. And that's what this video is. This is a longer video, but I promise you, if you hear me out, these confusing and questionable parts of the Bible will become more clear, and you'll have a much better understanding of what's going on behind the scenes of literally one of the most strangest parts in the Bible. So with all that being said, and without any further ado, Let's get into it. So the first thing that we need to deal with before we can have any serious conversation about the morality of the conquest of Canaan is whether any of this stuff actually happened. And I know that may sound like a strange place to start. You might be thinking, well, I thought we were here to talk about whether it was right or not whether it was real. But those two questions are obviously more connected than what they might seem. And here's why. The critics of the conquest of Canaan often want it both ways. When it suits them, the Exodus and the conquests are myth. Later propaganda invented by Israel scribes to legitimize their claims over the land of Israel. But when it suits them, there are historical events that prove God commanded an atrocity. So you can't really have it both ways. And so before we even ask, was it justified? It's worth asking, did it ever happen at all? Because the answer turns out to be more interesting than either camp usually admits. Let me give you the skeptical cases first, and I want to give it to you fairly. The standard skeptical position, which you'll hear a lot from academic biblical scholars and popular level atheist content, goes roughly like this. When archaeologists actually went and dug up Canaan, they didn't find what you'd expect to find if the biblical accounts were true. They didn't find evidence of a mass migration of people out of Egypt. They didn't find mass evidence of a mass destruction across all the Canaanite cities, which Joshua was supposed to have sacked. Even, the famous city of Jericho, the one with the walls that came tumbling down, turns out to have either been uninhabited or barely occupied during the period when the conquest was supposed to have happened. And since the absence of archaeological evidence is itself a kind of evidence, the conclusion is, well, it clearly didn't happen the way that the Bible says it did, and it possibly didn't even happen at all. Now, I want to tell you why I think that case is less airtight than what it sounds. The first problem is that it tends to assume that the biblical account says things that it doesn't actually say. Take the claim about the mass destruction, for example. Joshua, the actual text of Joshua in the Bible, says that there were 3 cities that were burned: Jericho, whatever, I'm going to say probably the rest of the video, and Hazor. That's it. The rest of the Canaanite cities, however, well, the Israelites weren't supposed to burn them. They were supposed to move in and live with them. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verse 10 and 11 literally says that God will give you great and good cities that you did not build, and houses full of all good things that you did not fill. So the promise assumes that the cities are standing and furnished. So when critics say, well, we don't find a burn layer across all of Canaan, the correct response is, well, of course we don't, because Joshua never said that he burned all of Canaan. He burned 3 cities. For everything else, the archaeological expectation would be a change in material culture and population continuity, which is actually more or less than what you find. Now, that's not a vindication of every detail in Joshua, but it does mean that the no destruction layers argument is aimed at a version of the story of the Bible it doesn't actually tell. The second problem is the numbers issue. So this is really fascinating. The Exodus account includes a large number of people for the Israelite population. Numbers that, taken literally, would give you somewhere between 2 and 3 million people leaving Egypt and wandering out through Sinai. Critics will say, well, we have no evidence of mass migration of that size, and we wouldn't expect to if it happened. 2 million people would have left a lot of traces, and they didn't. So, and that's true as far as it goes, but taken literally is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The Hebrew word actually translated as thousand in those passages, elef, doesn't always mean a literal 1,000. Like in other Old Testament contexts, it refers to like a military unit or a subdivision of a clan or a contingent. And a lot of serious scholars, people who are not trying to defend a fundamentalist reading, but just trying to read the Hebrew accurately, think that the numbers in the Exodus reflect a different ancient counting system than a literal head count. When you apply that reading, you get somewhere between 25,000 and maybe 200,000 people on the high end. Now, a group of that size moving through the Sinai over 40 years, well, you're not going to find that archaeologically 3,000 years later. The desert obviously has covered a lot of that stuff up. Like, who knows what kind of stuff the desert would do to that. But then there's the argument from silence problem more broadly. This is worth understanding because it actually affects how you evaluate almost a lot of the skeptical cases. Absence of archaeological evidence is not the same thing as evidence of absence. What do I mean by that? The distinction actually matters. We have enormous number of battles and military campaigns from the ancient Near East that we know happened because we have written records of them. There's Egyptian inscriptions, Mesopotamian records, the Bible itself, of course, for which we have almost no corresponding archaeological evidence. So the Egyptians fought constantly in Canaan during the period that we're talking about, and we have found direct physical evidence of very few of those campaigns. So archaeological excavation is incomplete. Sites get built over. organic materials that these people would have had decay, pottery gets moved around. And the picture archaeology can give you is always partial. Saying that we didn't find it, so therefore it didn't happen, doesn't follow, especially for events for, 3,000 years ago. Now, with that all being said, Jericho specifically is a really interesting example. So Jericho is genuinely complicated, and I want to give you the honest picture. When the famous archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho in the 1950s, she identified the main destruction layer, and it dated to around 1550 BC, which is too early for Joshua by at least a couple centuries on any reasonable chronology. That finding was a real problem for people who wanted straightforward archaeological confirmation of Joshua 6, and it's what the popular skeptical account usually lands on. But there's actually more to this story, and it comes from more recent work. For example, Italian archaeologist Lorenzo Nigro, I'm being careful here, led excavations at this place, which was ancient Jericho, and found that the 1550 destruction that Kenyon identified was that the site was not simply abandoned, and that rather a new mud brick structure was built on top of it, and then the site was occupied again. And then that structure disappears sometime between the 13th century BC, which is roughly when the conquest would have occurred on the most defensible dating of the Exodus. And it's replaced by a small rural village in the 12th century. Nigro also noted that the layer would tell us most clearly whether there was a 13th century destruction. The layer that would settle the question has been cut through and disturbed by later Iron Age and Roman era builders. It's not that there's evidence against Joshua 6, it's that the evidence that would answer the only question one way or another is literally physically gone. Someone's house from 1,000 years later is sitting on top of it. Now, I know that's kind of a lot, but the only reason I bring that up is because there's so much kind of like gray area in this whole thing. And that's really important to know, because you'll hear stuff all the time about, this archaeological stuff that like it doesn't prove it and then it does prove it, but it's a lot more gray than what most people realize. So is that a confirmation of Joshua? No, but it is consistent with it, and it removes the claim that, we've looked and there's nothing there, because actually we literally cannot see what was there. But there's one last piece of the historicity question worth mentioning, which is the city of Hazor. So Hazor was the most powerful city-state in Canaan during the late Bronze Age. And the text of Joshua actually calls it the head of all those kingdoms. It was enormous by ancient standards, and the archaeological evidence for this place and Hazor's destruction is very clear. It's unambiguous. There is a massive destruction layer at Hazor dated to the 13th century BC. It was burned completely. The palace was torched. The temples were deliberately defaced. Very specific, ideologically motivated destruction that looks like a conquest, not an accidental fire. And the scholarly consensus about this place, not even the conservative Christian consensus, literally like the mainstream archaeological consensus, is that this destruction was carried out by the Israelites. Now, that's a remarkable thing to have the mainstream field agree on, and that tends to get left out of the popular skeptical accounts. Now, I'm not going to sit here and tell you that archaeology has confirmed literally every single detail of the conquest narrative. It hasn't. There's no way for us to know, and anyone who tells you otherwise is probably overselling it a little bit. But the picture is substantially more interesting and more supportive of the historical core idea of Joshua than the popular, it's all a myth anyways. And more importantly, the texts deserve to be taken seriously on their own terms, which means actually reading what they say. So with that being said, we're going to get into the actual conquest of Canaan. It only gets crazier from here. Sometimes you have to spend a little time doing the boring stuff so that you can get to the juicy stuff. But anyways, let's read what they say. Because here's something I genuinely believe most people, both critics and a lot of the defenders, have wrong about the conquest. They think it was primarily a kill order, that God basically said, okay, go in there and murder everyone, and the Israelites went and did that. That's the picture. God plus Israel equals ethnic cleansing. And I understand why people think that, because if you read the English translation of certain passages, that's more or less what it sounds like. For example, Deuteronomy chapter 20, verses 16 and 17. In the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. Now that's pretty clear, right? Well, kind of. Let me explain what I mean. When you actually go through all of the relevant texts, not just the dramatic sounding passages, but like all of them, and you catalog every verb used to describe what Israel is supposed to be doing in Canaan, you find something that doesn't match the popular picture at all. Because there isn't just one verb that the author of Joshua used to describe this conquest. There are several of them, and they describe very different things. So there's the Hebrew verb yarash, which means to dispossess, take possession of, or drive out. And it constantly appears in Deuteronomy. You shall dispossess them. You shall drive them out before you. This is not a killing word. This is a displacement word. So somebody leaves and then the land changes hands and then no one has to die for that to happen. There's also garash, which means to drive out or expel. Same idea here. You are removing people from a territory. You're not necessarily killing them. And then there's nashal, which also means to dispossess or push out. Again, displacement. But then you have the killing verbs, which do appear. Naka means to strike, shamad, to destroy, and the most famous one that we're going to be spending a lot of time on, kherem, which usually translates to devote to destruction. Like I said, we're going to spend a lot of time on that one in a few minutes. The point is, the conquest texts are not solely God telling Israel to kill everyone. The overwhelming majority of what Israel was supposed to do in Canaan was displacement. Take the land, drive the people out, and then move in. God would have apparently been perfectly satisfied with a lot of the Canaanites just leaving. Like, there's actually a passage in Exodus where God says to Israel, I will send hornets ahead of you to drive out the Hivite, Canaanite, and Hittites before you, which I think is really funny. He's just sending bugs as the advance team for Israel. So he's not describing a massacre. He's describing a migration. They move out, Israel moves in. Which, remember, that's what God's promise was to these people, that they would have that land. And then there's an internal piece of evidence for this that I think is rather interesting. And it's something that doesn't get talked about enough. So in Deuteronomy chapter 7, you have both the destruction commands and the prohibition against intermarriage with the Canaanites in the same chapter, a few verses apart. Verses 2 and 3. Devote them to complete destruction. You shall not intermarry with them. And if you stop and think about that for literally 10 seconds, something should feel off immediately. Why would God need to warn Israel to not intermarry with people who are entirely dead? Who are you marrying? The conquest can't be the total annihilation of an entire people if literally in the same breath, there's a lot about what to do with the survivors. There has to be survivors for that warning to make any sense. And sure enough, throughout the conquest narratives, there are survivors. Rahab's a great example, the Canaanite woman in Jericho who hides the Israelite spies and is saved along with her entire extended family. There are the Gibeonites, a Canaanite people who tricked Joshua in a peace treaty by pretending to be from a distant land. And here's the thing, when Joshua finds out that he's been deceived, he's angry, but he honors the treaty anyways. He doesn't say, well, our covenant with you was obtained by fraud, so it doesn't count. He says, well, we gave our word and our word is binding. So the Gibeonites survive. And they actually end up eventually serving at the tabernacle. So these former Canaanites, who apparently God told them to kill all of them, were now working in the house of Yahweh. The theme is that this is not a picture of God issuing an extermination order on every man, woman, and child in the conquest of Canaan. Oh, but God says it. So then what were the killing commands about? Well, if displacement was the primary goal, when does killing come into it and why? And now, ladies and gentlemen, is where things get interesting. And it's probably the main reason why I wanted you to click on this video. When you map out specifically where the killing verbs appear, where the word kherem shows up, where the most explicit kill them all language is concentrated, a pattern emerges that is, as far as I'm concerned, one of the most significant things in the entire conquest narrative. Every single time you get the kherem in the conquest accounts, every time you get the language of total destruction, you are in the hill country. The mountainous, elevated, inland regions of Canaan. Hebron, which is where the Judean highlands are. Debir, south of Hebron in the hill country. Anab in the hill country. Jerusalem, built on a ridge. Lachish in the Shephelah foothills. Ai in the central highlands. Hazor up in Galilee in the hills. Every single location where the killing commands are issued is elevated terrain. The coastal plains, the valleys, the lowlands, that's where the displacement language happens. The hill country is where you find kherem. Yeah, okay, Nils, so what? Well, let's remember something from earlier in the story, shall we? Let's go back to Numbers 13 for a moment. This is the part of the story that most people know vaguely. Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan before the conquest. They're gone for 40 days. They come back. 10 of the 12 of them were terrified. They're like, oh my gosh, we can't go up against these people. They say like they are too strong for us. And the Israelites, hearing this, report break down and weep and then talk about going back to Egypt, which, given what Egypt was like for them, gives you a sense of just how frightened they actually were. So they were very, very scared. But why are the spies so scared? What exactly did they see? Well, they saw the Anakim. We saw the descendants of Anak there, the spies report. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. The Anakim, giants. And this isn't exaggerated language about tall people. These are a specific people group, a named clan that shows up repeatedly throughout the Old Testament books. They are enormous. They are in Canaan, and the spies encounter them in Numbers 13 is so terrifying that it derails an entire first attempt at conquest of Canaan. And it condemns an entire generation to die in the wilderness and delays the whole thing here by 40 years. And where exactly are the Anakim located? Well, the text tells us exactly. The hill country, Hebron, Debir, Anab, the highlands of Judah, the highlands of Israel. The map of Karem locations and the map of Anakim sightings, it's just the same map. That is not a coincidence. And to understand why it's not a coincidence, we need to go back quite a bit further than the book of Numbers. And I want to take a few minutes here to explain something about the Old Testament's understanding of the world. Because if you've never encountered this before, everything that I'm about to say is going to sound strange. And if you have encountered it through other videos on this channel or through your own study, bear with me for a little bit while I lay it out for the people who are coming to this fresh. Because it matters for everything that follows. The world of the Old Testament is not a world where there's one God, and then there's humanity, and then that's all that there is. The Hebrew text is full of divine beings. The word used is Elohim, which is a category word that can refer to God, to the gods of other nations, to angels, to demons, to all kinds of supernatural figures. What the Old Testament presents is something more like a divine council, a spiritual government with Yahweh at the top and a whole assembly of divine beings beneath him who have real power, real agency, and of course, the ability to rebel. Job 38 verse 7 talks about these beings singing together when God laid the foundations of the earth. Psalm 82 shows God standing in the divine council among the gods and passing judgment on them. 1 King 22 depicts the entire heavenly court converging to decide the fate of King Ahab. This is not metaphor in the way that we usually use that word. These are real beings and they matter for the story. Now, 3 things happen in Genesis 1 through 11 that set the stage for everything else in the Bible, and all 3 involve some form of cosmic rebellion, which is one of the reasons why God used this language specifically for the giants in the hill country. The first is the fall of humanity in Genesis 3. Adam and Eve, obviously, the serpent, the fruit, we all get it, we all know that one. The second is Genesis 6 verses 1 through 4, and I want to read this to you because it's one of the most strangest passages in the entire Bible, and most people have never either encountered it or were told the vision of it that butchers it, in my opinion, which is butchers what the text is actually saying. When man began to multiply on the face of the land and the daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were attractive, and they took as their wives any that they chose. And then the Nephilim were on the earth in those days. And also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them, these were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. So the sons of God, in Hebrew, B'nai Elohim, literally sons of God. The same term used in Job 38 for the divine beings who were there and present at creation. So these are not humans with godly qualities or Israelite judges. They are members of the divine council, supernatural beings who come down, violate the boundary between divine and human existence by taking human women, and the result of that is a race of hybrid offspring, giants, the Nephilim, and furthermore, the Anakim, who were the descendants. The ancient Jewish reading of this passage, which is extremely well attested in Second Temple, Jewish literature, the collection of writings roughly between 300 BC to 100 AD, and which is clearly assumed as the background by several New Testament writers, is that this was the second great act of cosmic rebellion. The first was humanity's fall. The second was this: divine beings abandoning their assigned roles, corrupting the human world. So God's response to that was a flood, which wasn't just a reset button, but rather a specific judgment on what this rebellion produced. But, and here's where this thread sort of continues, the flood doesn't end the story of the Nephilim. Genesis 6:4 clearly says that they were on the earth in those days and also afterward. so after the flood. The specific mechanics of how that works are something that the ancient world debated, and we can discuss that in other videos perhaps. But the point is that when the Israelites arrive in Canaan in Numbers 13, when the spies are sent, they don't encounter the Nephilim as a vague, distant memory. They encounter their descendants. And Numbers 33 says this explicitly. We saw the Nephilim there, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. But we have to talk about the third great rebellion. So Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel, humanity gathers and builds a tower to try to storm heaven, which most scholars kind of agree that it was a ziggurat, which was like a temple. The idea being that building a temple to get God or the gods to come to them, which was kind of the point. So humanity's pride saying they can put God in a box, but God comes down, confuses their languages, scatters them across the earth. But here's something that happens right after that scattering that most Bible readers don't notice, because it's tucked into a textual variant that most English translations have made confusing. Deuteronomy 32, 8, 9, which if you have watched this channel before, you likely know what I'm talking about. The version of this that I'm going to be reading is from the Dead Sea Scrolls text, which most scholars now believe is older and more original than the traditional Hebrew text used in most Bibles. The ESV also has this in it. It says, when the Most High gave to their nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people, Jacob his allotted heritage. It says according to the number of the sons of God, not according to the number of the sons of Israel, as some translations read. That's almost certainly a later scribal change designed to avoid the theological implications of the original one, namely because Israel wasn't even a nation yet. So the original says when God divided the nations after Babel, he assigned each nation to a member of his divine council, 70 nations, 70 divine beings. It talks about, I think in Genesis 10, there's a table of nations, right? One per nation. Israel stays directly with Yahweh. Everyone else gets a lesser divine being as their overseer, if you will. And those divine beings eventually abuse that role. They don't shepherd the nations towards Yahweh. They actually exploit them. They accept worship for themselves. They manipulate and corrupt the people. This is how we get some like the Old Testament gods of the Bible, and maybe even where Greek mythology and Roman mythology and that stuff kind of comes from. And Psalm 82 is the divine council scene where Yahweh passes judgment on these beings for exactly that. Quote, give justice to the weak and the fatherless, maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute. They didn't. And because they didn't, Yahweh sentences them. You are God's sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince. So here is the world that the Israelites are entering when they cross the Jordan River into the land of Canaan. The nations around them are under the corrupting influence of divine beings who have turned against Yahweh. Canaan itself, the land promised to Israel, is occupied by giant clans who are, in the theologically, cosmology of the text, the surviving descendants of the great second cosmic rebellion. The hill country of Canaan specifically is full of Anakim, people who literally trace their lineage back to the B'nai Elohim who came down in Genesis 6 and whose presence represents, in the most literal sense possible, the earthly arm of the divine insurgency against Yahweh. And Yahweh is giving that land to his people. So that's what's going on. And this is where we actually need to sit with the word Karem for a few minutes, like I alluded to before, because it is the word at the center of every moral objection to this conquest and the stuff that people have problems with. Karem in English Bibles, as you see it translated as devote to destruction, put under the ban, utterly destroy, stuff like that. All of those are in the right neighborhood, but they're all missing something, because Karem is not primarily a word used for violence. It's actually a word used for consecration. Here's what I mean. The root meaning of Karem is something like set apart entirely for God, taken out of human use, out of human reach, placed under divine claim. So when something is under Karem, the point is not simply that it gets destroyed. The point is that no human being gets to benefit from it. It belongs to God, and God determines what happens to it. So, for example, you can put animals under Karem. You can put the inanimate objects under Karem. So, for example, when Israel takes Jericho, the texts say that the gold, silver, bronze, and iron found in the city are Karem. They go into the treasury of the Lord. So no soldier is going to be pocketing the Jericho silver. It's consecrated. It belongs to Yahweh. And there's actually this whole subplot about this. Like a man named Achan takes some of the Karem items for himself, hiding a Babylonian robe under some coins in his tent. and this actually becomes a catastrophe for Israel that has to be dealt with before the conquest can continue. The point isn't that these objects are inherently evil. It's that they've been declared off limits to human appropriation. Achan violated a sacred boundary, so to speak. So when applied to people, Karem is God asserting that these specific people in these specific places are under his exclusive judgment. Not general human sinfulness, not an impulsive decision, a deliberate, specific idea that the people in these locations, the Anakim and their associated clans concentrated in the hill country, represent something that God is not going to allow to continue. They are, within the framework of the Israelite worldview, the living remnant of the Genesis 6 rebellion, positioned in the exact land that God is giving to his people and constituting the single greatest threat to Israel's survival into the purposes of Yahweh's plan, which ultimately was Jesus. And here's something that gets almost no airtime in these conversations. The conquest was not even Israel's idea, and it was not, from Israel's perspective, a fun one. Like, remember the spies? Remember that an entire generation of Israelites refused to go in? They refused, and then they died in the wilderness rather than face the Anakim. The next generation, the one that actually crossed the Jordan under Joshua, had every reason to be afraid. They were ex-slaves with no military tradition, walking into fortified cities against people that their parents had been terrified of, and they were not a dominant power bullying a weaker one. They were, from their own perspective, desperately outmatched. Everything that they accomplished required what the text describes as a supernatural intervention. You know, think of the Jericho walls falling down, right? Armies being routed, enemies driven out ahead of them, by something that they couldn't take credit for. And, that's all fine and good. But there's a very common objection to everything that I've literally said so far. And it goes something like this. Okay, Nils, but the text still says, kill every man, woman, and child. You can soften the text all you want, but those words are still in there. And that's fair. Those words are there. So let me explain why the words mean something different in their ancient context than what they sound like in ours. Ancient warfare had a literary convention, a specific widely used idiom for describing military victory. And that idiom used the language of total annihilation, even when describing campaigns that clearly did not produce total annihilation. For example, when you read the Egyptian royal inscriptions, you find pharaohs claiming to have destroyed and annihilated their enemies in campaigns when we literally see in other inscriptions from the same campaign. So literally lists of thousands of prisoners were taken. And when you read Mesopotamian military conquests, you find kings claiming to have killed everyone, and then literally in the next passage describe the tribute payments collected from the surviving population of the region that they just killed everyone in. So were they lying? No. Well, or at least it wasn't experienced as lying. It was a literary convention. Like the same way like the way you expressed decisive military victory in the ancient Near East was to say, yeah, I destroyed them completely. I literally left none of them alive. I absolutely bamboozled them. It was the modern equivalent is like a sports announcer saying that they annihilated the other team when the score was like 42-7. The language is an expression of the completeness of the victory. Actually, the scholar Kwon Younger, in his book Ancient Conquest Accounts, documents this extensively across Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Hittite sources. His conclusion is that if scholars had realized earlier how conventional this rhetorical form was, the moral questions about Joshua would look very, very different, because Joshua is using the same idiom as every other ancient Near Eastern military record that we have. And that shouldn't be surprising, because the Bible is a product of the culture that it was in. That's just how people wrote back then. And you can see this playing out within the text of Joshua itself. For example, Joshua 10:20, which, read this carefully, when Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking them with a great blow until they were wiped out, and when the remnant that remained of them had entered into the fortified cities. Stop. Right there, the text says that they were wiped out. And then the very next sentence, same sentence rather, it mentions the remnant that survived. Those two things seem contradictory until you realize what wiped out means in this literary context. And that's not a literal body count of 0, but a decisive and complete defeat. So the remnant is not an error in the text. It's evidence that the language was never meant to be read as literal census of the dead. There's also Joshua 15:63, which notes that the people of Judah could not drive out the Jebusites who lived in Jerusalem. So the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah in Jerusalem to this day. Wait a second. Aren't the Jebusites one of the groups that was supposed to be devoted to Karem? Yeah. And they're still there, living in Israel. The same book that has the total destruction language also matter-of-factly notes that various Canaanite groups survived and remained in the land. Because that was the reality. The destroy them all language was used as a literary form used to describe the campaign. It was not a promise that there would be no survivors, and the text itself doesn't pretend otherwise. One more thing about this. Some people, when they hear this argument, will say, okay, but God himself uses this language. In Deuteronomy, God is the one giving the kherem command. Doesn't that mean that it should be taken literally? And of course, I think the answer is no, for a really simple reason. God communicates with people in the language that they understand. When Jesus in Matthew 24 describes the destruction of Jerusalem using apocalyptic imagery, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light, the stars will fall from the sky, he's using the conventional literary form of Jewish apocalyptic writing, not giving a scientific description of what's going to happen. It could happen that way, but he's speaking to first century Jews in first century Jewish idiom. The same principle applies here. God giving military commands to 13th century BC Israelites using 13th century BC military idioms. The command is real, but the idiom makes sense in their culture. All that being said, I saw this quote somewhere that I can't remember where I saw it, but someone said something like, the question of why did God command the destruction of the Canaanites comes down to another question. How do you tolerate those who perform human sacrifices to other deities? That's also something that was going on. And a lot of these tribes, I think it was like the Amalekites or something like that. I could be wrong. Someone fact check me on that. But the Amalekites later on would attack Israel from behind, which is where all the women and children were at. So just from a war theory perspective, if you're constantly being raided and attacked and your women and children are being abused and being killed over and over and over again, is it really that big of a stretch to go and deal with those people? I don't know. But that all being said, I want to take a slight detour, and I promise it connects to everything that we've talked about. Because we've been spending a lot of time on how ancient people wrote about military campaigns, like the rhetoric that they used and the conventions and the idioms. And while we're in that neighborhood, I want to show you something that I genuinely find fascinating, and it directly ties into Joshua's conquest. And I think that'll help drive down the point that the Bible was written in a particular culture, and so we would expect to find things from the surrounding cultures. There's this ancient Canaanite text called the Curta Epic, and let me explain what Ugarit is first, because that's where this text comes from. Ugarit was a major city on the coast of what is now Syria. If you've seen my Baal video, I briefly talk about it there. It was one of the great Bronze Age trading hubs. At the height of its city, maybe 20,000 people or so, with connections across all the Mediterranean world. It was suddenly destroyed around 1200 BC, possibly by the mysterious sea peoples who evidently destabilized the entire Eastern Mediterranean at the end of the Bronze Age. And when archaeologists excavated the site starting in around, I think, 1929, they found something extraordinary. The city's library. Thousands of clay tablets, many of them intact, containing mythological texts, religious ritual stuff, even diplomatic stuff, and stories. All written in a previously unknown language, Ugaritic, which turns out to be closely related to biblical Hebrew. But why does this matter for the Old Testament? Well, because the people of Ugarit and the ancient Israelites were, in a very real sense, neighbors who shared a cultural world. They worshipped some of the same divine beings: El, Baal, Asherah, all the names you'll recognize from the Bible. They had very similar literary conventions. They used similar idioms, and the Ugaritic texts, when scholars finally translated them, turned out to be an enormous help for understanding passages in the Bible that had previously been obscure or confusing. The Curta Epic is one of the most important of those texts, somewhat damaged, and it tells the story of a king named Kirta who has lost everything. He lost his wives, his children, his heirs, all gone through a series of catastrophes, and he's left without a dynasty, and he's in despair. And El, the chief god of the Canaanites, appears to this guy in a dream. El tells Kirta, well, get up, stop mourning, I'm going to help you, and here's what you need to do. Raise a massive army, the greatest army that you can muster, march on the kingdom of Udum, ruled by a king named Pabel, and you're not going there for gold or silver or territory. You're going there for one thing: his daughter, Pabel's daughter, Hurai, a woman of exceptional beauty. You want her as your wife because you need heirs. So march on Udum, besiege it, and demand her. So then Kirta wakes up, and he does exactly what El told him to do. He raises an army, he begins to march, and then on the third day of the journey, they arrive at the temple of the goddess Asherah, and Here, Kirta stops and makes a vow. If I succeed, if I get her eye, I'll give you silver, I'll give you gold, I'll give you 3 times her weight in precious gifts. He makes the promise and then he moves on. And then the army arrives at Udam, and then they take their positions around the city. And then for 6 days, they do absolutely nothing. The army's just sitting outside the walls waiting. On the 7th day, however, King Pebel inside the city can't sleep. There's noise coming from the besieged city. The animals kept inside are making a racket, as tends to happen when a city is cut off and the animals haven't been let out to graze. He sends messengers to Kirta and he says, well, we'll give you silver, we'll give you gold, we'll give you, the territory, whatever you want, just go home. Kirta refuses all of it. He wants one thing. He wants the beautiful woman, her eye. He wants her bad. He's down bad. Pebel eventually agrees. The princess comes out, Kirta takes her home, they have many, many children, and then the dynasty is restored. That's like the basic story. Now, here's where things get interesting. Compare that to the opening chapters of Joshua. Specifically Joshua chapters 1 through 6, which covers everything from the preparation to cross the Jordan to the fall of Jericho. Both stories involve an army marching toward a target city. Both cover a period of 14 days, 2 weeks, 2 units of 7. Both have a significant divine encounter or ritual event that happens right at the midpoint. In Joshua, it's the crossing of the Jordan with the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the waters parting, and a memorial of stones erected. In the Curta Epic, it's the stop at Ashura's temple where Kirta makes his vow to the goddess. Both stories involve a covenant obligation contracted at the midpoint, and in both stories, someone breaks it. In Joshua, it's Achan who takes kherem items that he wasn't supposed to touch. In the Curta Epic, it's Kirta himself who forgets to pay Ashura what he promised. Both armies surround their target city for 6 days without attacking, and on the 7th day, everything changes. In Joshua, with the famous shouts and the horn blasts and the collapse of the walls. In the Curta Epic, with the noise that keeps Pebel awake and drives him to negotiate. Now, what do you do with that? A lot of internet level engagement with this will try to use it as a claim that the biblical writer stole the story from the Curta Epic, that Joshua is just a rehash of the Canaanite legend. Now, I want to tell you why I think that reading is both lazy and wrong, in my opinion. First, the question of which came first is actually not settled. Ugarit was destroyed around 1200 BC, which gives us a ceiling for when the Curta Epic was written. Depending on your dating of Joshua, and there are serious arguments for both early and late, the relationship could go in either direction, or neither could have directly influenced one another. Second, more importantly, the parallels that we're looking at are not unique to these two texts, actually. There's a battle narrative in 1 Kings 20, where the war between Ahab and Ben-Hadad, where the two armies camp opposite of each other for 7 days, and on the 7th day, battle begins and a wall collapses, killing 27,000 people. It's the same pattern, but it's not derived from either Joshua or the Curta Epic. So what all three texts are probably doing is drawing on a shared literary and military conventions of the ancient Near East. The 7-day siege period may have just simply been how you described a siege in these cultures, whether because that was generally how long it took armies to get into position, or because 7 was a number with religious significance across the region, or just because it was the idiom. Scribes in ancient Canaan and Israel were educated, widely read people who knew the literary traditions of the region. They usually wrote in idioms that those traditions provided. But here's the thing that I think makes this comparison genuinely interesting, and it goes something far beyond the surface level parallels here. I want you to imagine that you're an illiterate person in ancient Canaan. Someone who, knows the Curta story, you grew up with it, understand the religious significance and all that. And then you encounter the Joshua account. You start reading, and the shape of the story feels familiar. 2 units of 7, a divine encounter at the midpoint, 6 days of waiting, the 7th day everything changes. You've heard the structure before. And then you start noticing what's different. In the Curta Epic, El, the chief god, gives Kirta instructions in a dream. And that's it. El stays in heaven. He sends the dream, and then Kirta is on his own. In the Joshua account, Yahweh does something different. Right before the siege of Jericho, a figure appears to Joshua with a sword drawn in his hand, and then Joshua asks, "Are you here for us or for our enemies?" And the figure says, "No, I am the commander of the army of the Lord." Yahweh isn't just sending dreams from a distance, like the Curta Epic is. He shows up in person. He is, as it seems to be, boots on the ground. El, the Canaanite deity, blesses from above. Yahweh is literally in the army with his people. In the Curta Epic, the entire campaign is to get one king, one heir, one son, one dynasty. That's the idea. In Joshua, the campaign is to secure an entire nation's inheritance for generations. The scope is just completely different. And then Asherah, the goddess to whom Kirta makes his vow, who plays a real role in the story, is completely absent from Joshua. In her place, Yahweh is acting directly, parting the Jordan the same way he parted the Red Sea. There's no bargaining. There's no promise of gold and silver to a deity who will later have to just be appeased. Just Yahweh acting for his people. Now, if you're a Canaanite reading this and you notice these parallels, a slightly uncomfortable question might start to form. Wait a second. In the Curta story, El gives the king what he needs. And in the Joshua story, El, Yahweh, the same name, the highest deity pretty much, is giving Israel what they need. And Israel got it. And we're the ones who lost the hill country. So whose God was this really? Which, like I said, if you've seen my Baal video, I mentioned that the biblical writers would usually poke fun at the other religions of the time to show that Yahweh was actually the true God. This might be one of those times. Which finally brings us back to the conquest, and specifically to where it ended. This is such a cool thing. So Joshua 11, 21, and 22 has the summary of the whole campaign. After years of fighting, after the hill country campaigns, after every battle that we've talked about, Joshua writes the after action report. Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, from Debir and Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from all the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. And then the victory statement. There was none of the Anakim left in the land of the people of Israel. Isn't it interesting that that is Joshua's definition of success? Not we killed everyone in Canaan, not there are no more Canaanites. There are no more Anakim. That was the mission. That was the standard. And that is what was accomplished. And then, here's the detail that I need you to notice. It says only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. Those are 3 of the 5 cities of the Philistines, which were on the coast, outside the territory of Israel. The conquest of Canaan is declared complete. Joshua is satisfied, and the idea of them fleeing just shows up for a second and then it continues, as if it's almost an afterthought. Some of the Anakim survived. They ran west, and they ended up in Gath. The text just moves on, and then years pass from there, decades even. Judges comes, and then, comes and goes. Ruth, 1 Samuel. And then, in the valley of Elah, a Philistine warrior steps out from his army's line to issue a challenge. The man is from Gath. He is enormous. His armor weighs 125 pounds. The tip of his spear alone weighs 15 pounds. That man is Goliath. Man, I want you to feel what the biblical writer is doing here. This is not an accident. This is not even a coincidence. The conquest was declared complete in Joshua 11. But Gath, the last of the remnants of the Nephilim, and Anakim was still around. And it just waited there for 4 centuries until the man who would be the most important king in Israel's history walks into a valley and encounters the unfinished business. The thread running from Genesis 6 with the fallen sons of God to Numbers 13, with the spies, to the hill country campaigns, to that footnote in Joshua 11. It runs directly to the valley in the Judean foothills where a shepherd stands across from a giant descended from the people that the conquest was supposed to eliminate. David is, in a very specific way, the new Joshua. Joshua's mission was to remove the Anakim from the land. Joshua got most of them. David is walking into the part that Joshua left. When he loads that sling into his stone, he's not just a brave kid facing a big enemy. He's the continuation of a cosmological operation that started centuries before he was born, and that God had been guiding him towards this exact very moment. And what happens? Goliath falls. And it doesn't stop there. In the chapters that follow, David and his mighty men hunt down every single remaining giant of Gath. Goliath's brothers, 4 of them, all giants, fall one by one. In 2 Samuel 21:22 concludes this with a sentence that I find genuinely breathtaking. These 4 were descended from the giants of Gath, and they fell by the hand of David and by the hand of his servants. Every last one. The war that began with the B'nai Elohim coming down in Genesis 6, that produced the Nephilim and their descendants, that terrified the 12 spies in the valley in Numbers 13, that structured the entire conquest narrative around a very specific geographical point of Israel. It ends in one sentence in 2 Samuel. They fell by the hand of David and his servants. That is the completed narrative arc. That is a writer who knew exactly what they were doing across multiple books over a story that spans centuries. You can decide what you want to make with that theologically, but literally, by itself, that is extraordinary. But let me close with something that I think is the most important question buried in all of this. If God wanted the Anakim gone, and if God is capable of drowning the world, why did he need an army? Why did he need Joshua to go and do this? Why not just handle it directly? He'd done it before. And the answer that I keep coming back to is that God working through an army is kind of the point. You know, the entire biblical story is shaped by this pattern that God creates beings who bear his image, who are in some sense like him, and then he involves them in what he's doing. Perfect example is the divine council, how that works together. In Daniel 4, a decree about Nebuchadnezzar is attributed to both the divine watchers and to the Most High. It's a joint verdict, I guess. God ultimately makes it, but he kind of deliberates sometimes. In 1 Kings 22, same thing. The heavenly court brainstorms together on how to handle Ahab. God doesn't need a council. He doesn't need Israel. He doesn't even need you or me. But he works with them and he works with us anyways because you're a character in the story. The conquest of Canaan is God and Israel going together. I will fight for you, God says, again and again. And Israel having to show up to have courage to keep the covenant and then do their part. And then there's the other end of that thought, this conflict that we've been tracing from Genesis 6 through the Nephilim, through the conquest of David. It doesn't fully resolve with a military victory. The last giant is dead. The hill country is secure. The Anakim threat is over. But the corrupt divine beings that so many two sentence, the ones that Paul calls thrones, dominions, rulers, and authorities in Ephesians, and the powers behind the nations, they haven't been dealt with yet. And the way that they get dealt with is not what anyone would have predicted. The last giant of Gath was killed by a stone by a shepherd boy from Bethlehem. And the final enemy, death itself, is not defeated by a warrior, but by a man who let himself be killed and walked out of the tomb 3 days later, which is, objectively, the strangest ending to a conquest narrative ever written. Yet, here we are. There's a very specific reason that God had the biblical authors use the language that they did. And we may not understand every little thing, and sometimes it might make us feel uncomfortable. But I can confidently say in this situation with Joshua, but that the real reason that the authors were using kherem, this devoted to destruction language, there's so much more that meets the eye, and it is done in the coolest way possible. The connections for this story and what it means is just unlike anything else I've seen. But thank you so much for watching. If this is the kind of content that you come here for, subscribing genuinely helps me keep making this content. I genuinely hope all of you enjoyed this. As always, I'll see you in the next one. Also, if you're curious, everything referenced in this video, like the archaeological work and the textual scholarship, the theological background stuff, I'll put in the description if you want to take a look at it. Thank you guys so much. Oh, and cheers.